Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night, so another thing in learning in halacha and Tanya. Last time we started discussing very, very practical dinim that, again, they might sound confusing, but they're not once you get the gist of it, which is very, very important to get. So then it's much easier to understand all the concepts, and then you'll know what is a question to ask. And when you ask a shaila, at least you'll be able to give proper details. Okay, so I want to review quickly and briefly what we went through last week, because it is very, very practical. And in fact, after the class, somebody called me with a shaila, basically exactly what we discussed in the class. And the person was at the class. So we're going to go through a little bit just to review. And then, because once we get the concept straight, it's fine. Okay, the thing is like this. Something which is clean and has taste of meat absorbed within it, that taste is fresh for 24 hours. After 24 hours, the taste is blemished taste. So in other words, if you have a meat pot, a clean meat pot, but it's meat because meat was used in it. The din is after 24 hours, that's not really a meat pot. And therefore, if somebody would cook parve in that pot, that parve could be eaten together with milk. Because again, the taste that's absorbed within the pot after 24 hours is not really a taste, it's a blemish taste. So therefore, after 24 hours, if you cook something parve in a meat pot, you're allowed to serve it together with milk. What happens if the pot was used within 24 hours and you cooked parve food in that pot? So then the din is, because it's within 24 hours, there is a fresh taste of milk in that pot, even though it's only absorbed within, but it's still fresh. And therefore, if you make something parve in that pot, you cannot eat that parve dish together with milk. You could eat it right before, you can eat it right after. You definitely do not need to wait 6 hours after that food. So again, to give you a practical example of this din, somebody cooked macaroni in a meat pot. If the meat pot was used that day for meat and is clean, and you cook macaroni in it, you cannot put cheese onto the macaroni. But you can eat the macaroni right before cheese and right after cheese. If the pot wasn't used for 24 hours and is clean from meat, and then you made macaroni in that pot, so then you are allowed to add cheese into that macaroni, because the cheese is not at all meat, because it was a blemished taste of meat. Not into the pot, obviously, because the pot's meat, but I'm saying you can put the macaroni into a plate, and then you would be allowed to put the cheese on top of that macaroni. Now, that's simple. But again, once you have this concept, we will understand dinim as we move along in this part of kitchen dinim. If somebody made something parve in a dairy pot that was used that day for meat, dairy, but it's clean, and somebody now took a clean meat spoon that was also used within 24 hours for meat. So now you have a pot that was used within 24 hours, the spoon that was used within 24 hours, and you mix the parve vegetable soup in it. So if there's no 60 times the spoon, that means if the vegetable soup, let's say, does not have 60 times the amount of the soup that went into the vegetable soup, the din is everything is treif. The pot is treif, the vegetable soup is treif, and the spoon is treif. Why is that? Because now you have fresh taste of meat in the spoon, you have fresh taste of milk in the pot, and now they're mixing together into that parve dish. And the parve dish doesn't have 60 times the problem. It doesn't have 60 times the size of the pot, and it doesn't have 60 times the spoon. So now you have a mixture in this parve dish. You have a mixture of meat and milk, which is fresh, and it's not nullified 1 in 60. So therefore, guess what? The pot is straight, the spoon is straight, and the vegetable soup is straight. Because it's all within 24 hours. It's all a fresh taste. And there's nothing to nullify it. Everything is clean. If it's dirty, you got the bigger problems. Everything is clean, but the fact that they were both used that day, and that the pot was used that day, and the spoon was used that day for opposite genders, one for dairy, one for milk, one for meat. You don't have 60 times the amount, everything is straight. Now, what happens though, if somebody was cooking in a milchic pot that was used that day for dairy, but you're cooking parve, and then you mixed it with a spoon, a meat spoon that was not used for 24 hours. It wasn't used for 24 hours for dairy. Sorry, for meat. It wasn't used for meat. So now you have a milk pot that was used within 24 hours, a meat spoon that wasn't used for 24 hours. So then the din is like this. The food is kosher. The pot is kosher. Why? Because the meat on the spoon is not really meat. So you don't have fresh taste of meat in milchiks. Even though the milchiks is a fresh taste, it was used that day. The problem is then you have to kosher the spoon. Why? Because it's a meat spoon that now has fresh taste of milk from the milk pot that was used within that day for dairy. Now, same thing would be in the reverse. Okay, now, what happens? Somebody, what was that again? 1 second. You say spoon used in 25th, even if it was used for cold. When we're speaking, it wasn't used for 24 hours. It's a very good point. It means it wasn't used for hot. If you had a meat spoon that was used for cold meat and was washed off, not in hot water, because then the hot water makes the meat hot, but you rinsed it off in cool water, that spoon was not used for 24 hours. That spoon was not used for 24 hours because it had to be used for hot within 24 hours. Now, what happens if somebody cooked, again, the similar case, just a slightly different details. Somebody cooked in a dairy pot that wasn't used for 24 hours. Again, they cooked macaroni. And then they put a meat spoon that was used that day for hot meat. So again, if there's 60 times the amount, there's no problem. Then everything's okay. But what happens if there was no 60 times the amount. If there was no 60 times the amount, so technically you had like this. The milk pot was not used for 24 hours. So the macaroni really doesn't have dairy taste in it because the pot wasn't used for 24 hours and it's clean. Now you're stirring it with a meat pot that's clean, but used within 24 hours. Halachically, you can eat that macaroni with meat. You're allowed, some people are machma, we don't pass like that. You're allowed to eat that macaroni with meat, not with milk. Even though you cooked it in a clean milk pot that wasn't used for 24 hours, but it's not really a milk pot because it wasn't used for 24 hours. Now you're stirring it with a meat pot that was used with meat spoon, a meat spoon that was used for hot within 24 hours. So technically, the macaroni is now meat. You can't eat it with cheese. You can't eat it with cheese. But you can eat it with meat. But the pot needs to be kosher. Why? Because now you put in a spoon, a meat spoon, and the meat spoon was used within 24 hours. So it's a fresh meat taste, and you didn't have 60 times the macaroni against the spoon. So now what's happening is the fresh taste of meat is going into the macaroni, into the pot. So the pot is straight. So again, you have crazy scenarios where the food is kosher. The spoon in this case would be kosher because the taste of milk from the pot was blemished. So the spoon is good. The macaroni you have to eat with meat. The pot you need to kosher because the spoon was used that day. What happens, and this also happens many times, none of them were used for 24 hours. In other words, somebody cooked macaroni in a milk pot that was clean and not used for 24 hours. And they took a halachic spoon, a meat spoon that also wasn't used for 24 hours. And they stirred the macaroni. Then the halacha is everything is good. Because you don't have milk or meat. Because the milk taste was blemished because it wasn't used for 24 hours. The meat taste is blemished because it wasn't used for 24 hours. Not the pot, not the spoon. So the macaroni is a completely part of. You can have it with meat if you want, and you can have it with milk if you want. You could put meat sauce on, not at the same time. You could put meat sauce on the macaroni, or you could put cheese into the macaroni. You take it out of the pot, obviously. You put it into a bowl or whatever, and in that bowl, it's not milk, it's not halachic, it's completely potted. You could do with it whatever you want. So sometimes, in the cases we just mentioned, sometimes the pot is treif, the food and the spoon are good. Sometimes the spoon and the food is good, the pot isn't. Sometimes none of them are good, and sometimes they're all good. So again, whatever wasn't used for 24 hours is not going to make a problem. The guy that's making the problem is the thing that was used within 24 hours. And that's going to be the problem. So sometimes it could be the spoon that was used within 24 hours. Sometimes it could be the pot that was used within 24 hours for hot. And sometimes if they neither were used for 24 hours, then everything is good. And by the way, this last scenario happens very, very often. Somebody cooks something in a pot that wasn't used for 24 hours, and then they take the opposite gender spoon or whatever, and it also wasn't used for 24, then everything is good. What happens if you don't know if the things were used for 24 hours or not, within 24? You don't know. So then halacha's assumption, halacha says, we assume if you don't know, the assumption it was not used for 24 hours. The assumption is, Gemara has an expression, stam kalim eina ben yamin. A regular kalim, we don't know. Was it within 24 hours? Not within 24 hours. As long as it's clean, we assume halachically it was not used for 24 hours. That everything would be based on that. Everything would be accordingly good, and there wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so these are the general guidelines. And once you get the point of same day makes a problem, more than 24 hours doesn't make a problem, then you can assume and understand all the details. Number one, how to ask a question, when you need to ask a question, and many times what the answer is. But when you need to ask a shaila, when you call the Rav, you need to find out before you call. If you don't want to rule yourself, you need to know what was used when for hot, what was used, you don't know. Can you find out if it was used or not within 24 hours? And then you're able to present a shaila very, very easily and not a problem. Okay, now we're going to go into another din, but with a knife. All these dinim we're talking about now, including today, is when you're not dealing with sharp items. You're not dealing with onion, garlic, lemon, spicy things, hot peppers, things like that. Those are completely different dinim. Here we're talking a very simple thing. Somebody has a hot roast. Took a hot roast meat out of the oven. And somebody cuts it, you want to slice the roast. By mistake, you took a dairy knife. A dairy knife. The meat. Okay? So therefore, you need 60 times the amount against the blade of the knife that cut the meat. Which means like this. If I had a massive roast and I cut it in half. Now you have the blade and you have the handle. The handle doesn't count because it's not cutting the meat. You have the blade of the knife. If you cut the meat in half, and then you realize, oh my gosh, it's a dairy knife. If the meat, which it probably does unless it's a tiny piece of meat, but if the meat has 60 times the size of the blade, which is very, very thin, then the meat is kosher. But the plate, okay, let's discuss this scenario, making it easier. You only cut the meat in half. Okay, you had a big roast, you cut the meat in half with a dairy knife. That was used that day. Okay. Then the din is, you have 60 times the amount. The meat is, if you have 60 times the amount, it's fine. Even then, if you have 60 times the amount, you need to cut in the place where the knife cut. I'm going to explain the din. There's two opinions. One says you need to cut off 2 centimeters, which is called kedein netila. And most opinions say you have to cut what's called kedei klipa. Kedei klipa means a very thin peel. In other words, you need to cut from that meat in the middle, even though there's 60 times the amount. So the meat is kosher. Nevertheless, the place where the blade touched, but mean both halves where you cut it, you need to remove a very thin, you have to cut off a very thin layer of meat, meaning that you can cut a thin slice. It won't break, not very, very thin, because then it breaks up. That you have to cut off a thin slice of meat, that you cut off the whole slice. It doesn't break up. from both sides. Why is that din? What's the purpose of that din? The purpose of the din is there's something called in halacha duchka de sakina. Duchka de sakina means is pressure of the knife. Okay. Therefore, because the meat was used, the knife was used that day for milk, even though you don't notice it, but the knife's pressure of cutting, when you cut the knife with pressure, some of the fattiness of the knife goes into the area that you cut. So because of that, the din is the place that you cut, you need to do what's called kedei klipa, meaning you have to cut a very thin slice, the thinnest that you can cut, that would still not fall apart on both sides of the cut. And because it was 60 times in the meat, everything is kosher. Everything is kosher. What happened if the knife was not used for 24 hours for milk? This is all if the knife was used within 24 hours and you have 60 times the amount of the meat against the blade, the meat is kosher. Nevertheless, the place where you cut, meaning both sides of the cut, you need to cut off kedei klipa, a thin slice. Some people say what's called kedei netila. If you could be machmir, it's better, it says, to cut off 2 centimeters wide from both sides. Now, if the knife wasn't used that day from dairy, then everything is good. But you still need to cut off kedei klipa on the 2 sides. That means if the knife was used that day and you don't have 60 times the blade, the whole meat is straight. If you have 60 times the meat against the size of the blade, then everything's kosher because you have 60 times the amount. But you need to cut off a little piece on each side. If the knife was not used for that day, so therefore it's a blemished taste of meat, nevertheless, you still need to cut off where you cut a little piece of the meat on each side. Why? Because again, there's the fattiness that's on the knife because of the pressure. And this is different than a spoon or a fork. You use a spoon, there's no pressure anywhere. When you cut a thick piece of meat, then you have the pressure of the knife. And because it's hot, that's what happens. Now, obviously, the knife is going to have to be kosher. Whether the knife was used that day for dairy or not used that day for dairy, the knife just cut hot meat. And cutting hot meat, the knife is straight. You have to be able to kosher it. Sometimes you're allowed to kosher a knife. Sometimes you can't kosher a knife, depending what type of blade it is and the area between where the blade fits into the handle. Is it clean? Is it not clean? You know, is it kosherable? Things like that. But because it's hot, by the way, you have to kosher it in boiling hot water. What happens though? You cut cold meat with that knife. Because it's cold, the meat is cold, everything's cold. So only you have to cut off a little bit where you sliced it, but everything's good. Everything is good because it's cold. What?
A dairy knife used that day, even used that day?
Even if it's used that day, but because it's cold, it's not transferring any trace, any meat or milk, because cold doesn't transfer, only heat transfers. But in that case, how do you kosher the knife? Now, it wasn't used for hot, but nevertheless, the knife needs to be koshered in a certain way. Or I'll give you a reverse scenario. Somebody has a block of cheese. Okay, until now, we're talking about cutting meat with a dairy knife. What happens if you have a block of cheese, not sliced cheese, a block of cheese, and you cut it, it's cold, and you cut it with a clean meat knife. So the cheese is good because it's all cold. Just like the meat is cold because it's all good because it's all cold. How do you kosher the knife? So there's a din halacha that's called mi'itza bakarka. You have to stick it in hard ground 10 times. You don't have to kosher it in boiling hot water. You don't have to do anything. What you need to do, take the knife, find hard dirt, not soft mud. You have to take hard dirt and stick the knife in the ground in different places 10 times. Why? Because we learned at the beginning, the way it becomes treif, that's the way untreif it. It becomes treif from boiling hot water. You kosher with boiling hot water. It becomes treif completely with fire, direct fire. You have to kosher it in fire. How did this knife make a problem? Because of the pressure of the meat knife cutting the cheese, the pressure of the dairy knife cutting the meat, but it's all cold. But there's still pressure. That means the pressure made cheese go into the knife. The pressure made the meat go into the knife. So how do you undo it? The halacha is you take it and you stick the knife in hard ground 10 times, and that kashers it. This explains a mistake. You hear this a lot of times from people. They said, yeah, when something becomes treif, you bury it in the ground for 3 days. You ever hear that? I heard that a lot of times. You bury it in the ground for 3 days. Then mixing up, soaking something for 72 hours and sticking the ground in that. It's like we once moved into our first house in Beverly Hills. So we were renting. And the lady was Jewish, but she had a dishwasher. So they said, no, we can't kosher the dishwasher. So she says, what's the problem? Put salt all over it. You know, she got mixed up between koshering a chicken with koshering a dishwasher. You put salt. How about if you use a parvinates to slay the cheese? We stick the knife 10 times and then this part. Yes. If you use the parv knife to cut hard cheese, I'm talking about cream cheese. I'm talking about a block of cheese. And by mistake, you use the clean parv knife and everything is cold. Again, yes, you stick the knife into hard ground 10 times and the knife remains parv. Okay, let's go to Tanya. And again, I'll mention again, but for those that joined late, Mitzvah Shem, next Monday and Wednesday, there is no class. I'll be out of town. But the following, so there's no class, not Monday and not Wednesday, and the Mitzvah Shem the following week, we will resume.